So we are at the Torah portion, Balak. And after I kind of studied out what I wanted to do for tonight, and I realized if I did everything I wanted to do tonight, it would be a double lesson, which would mean we wouldn't have a lesson on the Song of Songs tomorrow. I'd have to stretch it over 2 classes. So what I thought I'd do, we'll just half it. There's enough of what's going on in Balak that carries over into the next Torah portion, Pinchas. So I'll just make it a part 1 and a part 2. So part 1 will go into Balak, and then next week we'll do part 2, which what I really want to try to undertake, if I can. I try to avoid the subject of sorcery and magic if I possibly can, but when the Torah doesn't, I can't. So I know in the past we've looked at it a little bit, and we're not going to do much more than look at it a little bit tonight and next week. But what I do want you to see is what the Torah is pointing out to you is there's certain patterns here that you can watch for. And the reason that we're headed in that direction is because we are reliving a unique time, which is the time of the book of Acts, where you have a lot of people who previously had very little experience probably with the Torah, with Shabbat, with dietary laws and so forth. And all of a sudden you have, not just hundreds, but thousands of people who are coming to faith in Messiah Yeshua. And then the big question is, well, how exactly do we navigate through this? Obviously, they can't navigate through it exactly like their Jewish brothers and sisters who were born into the covenant. They grew up knowing things about the covenant. You have people who were basically in pagan temples the day before, and now they're trying to navigate their way through the Bible. And it's not like we are. We're so privileged. We can just pick up a Bible anywhere. We can pull up a Bible online. They didn't have that kind of access. If they were going to hear the Bible, they would have to go into a synagogue and listen to a public reading. And there again, sometimes you've got the language barrier. You're going to have a translator. And that's why we have the Targums. And it may not be that there's a translator in your language. So sometimes I think we fail to appreciate how difficult it was for first century people, because we feel like we're the only people this ever happened to. Like, what are we doing with the Torah? How fast do we go? How little, how much is really required of us where we are in this particular time period? And so they had a very similar problem. But what you'll notice in the book of Acts is something that's happening to us too. There were a lot of insincere people who tried to hook into the power of what was going on. The power of the Holy Spirit was moving this gospel. It was moving the word of Adonai across the civilized earth as they knew it. But along with this powerful move of the Holy Spirit, there were also other spirits moving. There were also dark things moving, and they sometimes would say the right things. Now, sometimes they very quickly exposed themselves. They would just turn into wild animals and attack the apostles. In other cases, it sounds like they're on the same page. But then, you'll have this thing where, an apostle will turn around and, cast the devil out of them. When actually they're saying something very consistent with what the apostles are saying and doing. In fact, they're saying, listen to them, listen to the apostles. And the apostles are like, come out of her. You fool of the devil, get out of her. And so, what's going on here? Well, again, we go back to the Torah for the answers. And I think if we can pick out the patterns of what we're going to read in Balak about this process of how they made, the only thing honest these guys did was make an honest effort to curse Israel. So at least they were really upfront with their evil. But for some reason, the Bible is very careful to lay down the pattern for us of the steps they took in order to make an attempt to curse Israel. And if the Bible is that careful to lay down the steps for us, then it tells us we need to know the steps. So we can be conscious of the forces that are out there. And if they have tried to attack or they have tried to curse in this particular manner before, like we said last week, it may not be identical as the way that we read about it in the Torah, but there might be similar elements that we need to look for. And the problem sometimes, it's just like we see with Balaam. He's hearing from the Holy One in this particular instance. Now, the evidence is that he was getting his words prior to this particular incident from another source, that he was actually a sorcerer, a practicer of the dark arts. It said that he actually used the forces of what we would call tameh or tuma in the Torah. Remember from the book of Leviticus, things are in two categories ritually. They're either tahor or tahara, which means ritually pure, or they are tameh or tuma, which indicates they are impure. They've somehow touched the realm of death. And if that particular thing is attached to you, then you have to go through a specific process in order to be purified and go into the Mishkan or go into the Mikdash later. So it's not as if you sinned if you happen to be in a state of tameh, it just being human, just going through your normal human activities, even keeping a commandment like childbearing, that can take you into a state of ritual impurity. So it doesn't mean you sinned. But if you fail to manage it according to the scripture, then you can fall into sin. And that's where we were talking about. You can leave a vulnerability. You can leave a door open for some things that Yeshua cautioned us about. And so there's specific procedures we can see in the pattern of the Torah portion, even in the blessings that are forced out of Balaam's mouth, the very blessing that he blesses them, we can actually find the curse that he was attempting to put upon them. Because what happened is just his tongue's being twisted around. He's normally going to speak curses. That's who he is. Remember the 7 abominations of the wicked lamp? It's who you are now. There's no question. Balaam is, 100% 7 ways abominable. He can't tell the truth. Even when he tells the truth, it's not the truth. And so with him, anything that comes out, you pretty much have to flip it around the other way to get to what's actually he's thinking or what his actual plan is. So he's pretty crafty. And so he joins forces with a guy named Balak, who's also pretty crafty. He's crafty enough that he's taken a lesson from the Israelites defeating the giants, Sihon and Og. And he says, well, the way not to defeat the Israelites is to fight them in battle. So there has to be another way. And so Mr. KG sends off for somebody equally as despicable as he is. And so we have this unholy union here, and they apply their arts together. And it's by looking at specifically what each of these 2 men are doing that we can find this pattern of sorcery, because sorcery is something that comes up repeatedly, not just in the Torah, it comes up in the prophets, all the way to the book of Revelation. We're reading about sorcery. And so I don't encourage you to go out and buy books on sorcery to find out about it, but I do encourage you to read what scripture has to say about it, so that if you feel like you've encountered it, if perhaps somebody is trying to do something similar to you, then you'll know how to counteract it, which you already do, by the way. You're sitting here doing it right now. This is how you counteract. Like Yeshua said, you can't just get rid of the unclean thing. You have to pack the house back with the furniture of purity. Because if you leave the empty space, the unclean thing is going to go to that place which is uncovered. And you really only get hints about it sometimes in the book of Leviticus. We've edged around it, I know, in years past, because it's not really fun for me to try to teach. But it even goes back to if you have a vessel, let's say this glass of water. Well, the green screen just kind of messed that up, didn't it? Okay, now you can see my glass of water. It's fine if I'm going to sit here tonight and sip on this glass of water. But what does Torah say I must do? If I'm going to go to bed tonight, or if I'm going to leave this glass of water out for an extended period, I need to cover it. Uncovered vessels are a thing in scripture. It's impurities tend to move in when we leave things uncovered, which there's a spiritual lesson there. Does it mean that, something horrible is going to happen if I take a sip of water in the morning after it sat out all night? Not likely. But the principle is there to teach us, make us conscious. I'm way probably more concerned about bacteria or bugs falling in it, which takes it to another category of uncleanness. If I do that, there's a practical reason for covering your vessels. But if there's a practical reason, you have to also look for the spiritual reason. And it has to do with how you protect yourself, because there are forces out there that we can't see, but Torah very clearly teaches us about them, to be conscious of them and to manage our surroundings. So let me share the screen with you. Here we go. Okay, so I've just entitled this The Two B's of Magic. And this is going to be part 1, which is Balak the Destroyer. Numbers 22:2 through 25:9, Micah 5:6 through 6:8, Psalm 79, and then Matthew 3:8 through 9. And where is your memory book? Here it is. Okay. I made this one really simple. Balak does mean destroyer. So for the Torah portion Balak, I just put the destroyer Balak hires Bellam to curse Israel, but all he can do is bless them. Baruch Hashem. So here's our tip of the week. And this will also extend into next week, because I think I'll have clearer examples for you next week as we get into the book of Acts. But something to watch for. And you probably already know it. If you've lived long enough and you've been around somebody who is just a bad actor, they've probably used some of these techniques. At any rate, for those who act in the realm of death or impurities, they will often borrow from or imitate the realm of life in order to deceive. This is a vital component of sorcery or magic. Israelites who willfully rebel against or neglect the purity laws become vulnerable to deceit and unclean spiritual forces that are able to excite the life force of the soul. The soul is the nefesh. It's your appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect. Nowadays, it's very fashionable for people to say, well, I'm not religious, but I am a spiritual person. No, they're not spiritual people. They're probably being manipulated by spiritual forces, but those spiritual forces are linking up with them because they're basically taking the steering wheel of a NASCAR. The soul is that powerful. So a spiritual entity that has no body, if it wants to act out certain things, it can only act out those things if it has a body. And that body is driven by a soul. That's the energy, that's the heat, appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect. And so if there's unclean spiritual activity, it's going to appeal to your soul. You're going to confuse it with your spirit. You're going to say, well, this is a spiritual thing. But this is what unclean things do. They're going to look at your appetite. They're going to look at ways to addict you to things. It's going to look at ways to entice you intellectually. Philosophy gone wild, we might call it. what you taste for, what you crave, intellectual fulfillment. You might consider yourself somebody who's an eclectic reader. Well, if you're an eclectic reader, depending on just exactly how eclectic you are, you're probably reading a lot of things, words, introduce things. And that's one of the patterns we want to look at. What are the elements of sorcery? They mimic the elements of holiness. And so holiness involves words. It involves the holy word, the divine word. And so if there's an impure force, it will also try to manipulate words, because words, they click in there like Legos with us. And so we identify these words. It'll give us this little, rush of dopamine. We'll get a little adrenaline. That's how it's using the life force of the soul. Human beings tend to confuse it with being spiritual. And that's why we even have to be careful in our walk. We can get so caught up in how a spiritual experience feels that we completely miss the fact that the soul is what was manipulated, but the spirit was just kind of being taken along for the ride, rather than the soul being the authority in the situation. Workbook 4, great resource in terms of maybe overdoing a little bit, showing you that division between the spirit, the soul, and the body. But sometimes you have to overdo it a little bit in order to understand how those three things work together. And so when we're looking at an unclean force that we would say is from the realm of death, at least for a human being, it's a realm of death. It might be their existence, but for us, it's death. And so we're commanded not to have anything to do with it. We're not supposed to be consulting unclean spirits. We're not supposed to be trying to talk to the dead. We're not supposed to be touching the realm of death. Just because we don't understand what we're playing with when we do, and more importantly, because he said so. He knows more about the way that we're made than we do. And so therefore, he knows where we're vulnerable to these things. So Balak does mean destroyer. And that's exactly what happens. And that's the irony of an unclean spirit that tries to attach itself to you. It wants to attach itself to a healthy human being so that it can manipulate that human being. Again, it's got the engine, it's got the soul, and then it's got the body in which it can experience these things. But remember, it's not us. So the reality for one of those things, whatever you want to call it, is not our reality. See, our creation is unique. And so often what these unclean spirits will do will literally kill their host. They don't understand life as we were created to live it. They're coming from a realm of death, and the ultimate end is they will drive that body and soul into death. So at the same time, they're trying to experience what it feels to be alive through a human being. They don't know how to manage that. They're completely inept. Ultimately, I mean, an addiction. Can you control a human being through an addiction? Yes. But ultimately, that addiction, if not managed, it would lead that person to a death, an untimely death. And so he's lost his host. Completely different discussion. But it's, it's something to be aware of. It's definitely worth, guarding against anything. I mean, we're not just talking about drugs or alcohol. Your soul can be addicted to your own way. It's not just in the realm of substance abuse. You can become addicted to your own pride. You can become addicted to your own opinion. You can become addicted to your own anger. There's any door that they can use, they will use. And that's why we have to guard the door. Scripture tells us how to guard the door. So in Numbers 22:2, it says, Vayere Balak ben Sipur. And so it's identifying our driving force here. The man's name is Balak, and the Torah portion is named after him, which means destroyer. And that's ultimately what happens with sorcery. It leads to destruction. Sometimes it starts out with seemingly, benign things like a Ouija board or going to the fortune teller at the carnival or something. Don't do it. Don't do it. It's not benign. They're playing with forces, and it's dressed up to look like it's just fun, but it's not. It leads to destruction. The word tells us that time after time. Harry Potter will lead you to destruction. It may not happen immediately. It may not happen in a week or a year, but you are planting these seeds of impurity. Death is being planted in the minds of young children when they are least capable of resisting the growth of those seeds. And so he's called Balak ben Sipur, or Balak, destroyer, son of a bird. And here's what that means. We looked up kind of the types of sorcery that Moab was involved in. And the sages believe that it's both Balak and Bellam who were sorcerers, not just Bellam, because as we can see in the Torah portion, it's Balak who decides which places they try to go and curse. It's Bellam who has the words, or he thought he did. So Bellam is supplying the words, but Balak is saying, here, here, here. And you'll notice that with sorcery, it's going to mirror much of the way that our faith life functions. It's going to be associated with a certain place. It's going to be associated with a certain appointed time. It's going to have certain ritual objects with rituals that go with it. It's just that they're drawing up on a source of death. So they believe that Balak was also a magician in Moab, and they think he's called Balak ben Sipur because he was proficient at an ancient magic that was done in Moab, where they would actually draw on the forces of Tumah, and you're familiar with that from Tameh, or impurity, from the book of Leviticus. And remember, that happens when somehow you've touched the realm of death. And what they would do is they would craft the image of a bird from gold. They'd make a gold head, they'd make a silver beak, copper wings. I'm not sure how the rest of it looked. That was about as much as I can find in the Demon Dictionary. Well, it's actually not a Demon Dictionary. It's the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible. And they would have to assemble each of these parts at a specified time of day. And the final piece that they would put in is they would take the tongue of a living bird and insert that into their image. And if you'll notice, they use the same metals that the 4 beast kingdoms are made of. And it had the same quality. It could deceive people into thinking it came alive. And what they would do with this image of the bird, they would place it on the sill of an open window to face the sun by day and the moon by night. 7 days later, they say the bird's tongue would make a kind of a tinkling sound, and then the magician would pierce the tongue with a golden needle, and the bird would start talking, and this is the way they foretold the future. And so Balak was believed to be this type of sorcerer, like a soothsayer, a predictor of the future. And it was based on his skill at particularly fashioning these unclean birds. But in this case, what he doesn't really need is to predict the future, because his future has already been clear. Israel is coming home. And this is not what he wants to happen. He says, okay, well, I have to call in a specialist. I look into the future. I can see the future is not what I want. Now I have to come in with another skill, somebody who's skilled at cursing, so that it can impair or impede this future that I'm seeing. And that's the problem we've talked about with sorcery and fortune telling before. They might get part of the picture right, because they do live beyond this natural realm. They do live in a spiritual realm, but they can only give you a partial picture. And so it will deceive you. They can give you enough of the picture to make you think, oh, wow, this really works. But it's deceiving you by giving you part of that picture. And that's why, in the book of Daniel, he calls Daniel in. He's ready to put them all to death, because not only can they not even give him a partial picture, they can't give him anything. But kings and nobles would keep sorcerers on hand for this reason. They could give them part of the picture. Pharaoh's magicians could give him part of the picture. They just couldn't really give him, the song of the sea. And so they believe that Balak, being a sorcerer, did foresee that the glory of the Holy One was going to defeat his powers of Tumah, the powers of death that he was tapping into, that life was going to prevail over the destroyer. And the Midrash says this talking bird he had suddenly flew away. And then when it returned, it had its tail singed in flames. And that's how he figured out that the Holy Spirit was going to pretty much burn his tail. So rather than mend his ways, he does the end around like King Nebuchadnezzar did. He invites Balaam to curse Israel. And the Midrash says this, and I realized when I put it in here, did I want to put this in here or not? Because it would be another lesson all by itself, talking about the mazal. It's complicated, and I just prefer to not get into it. So this is actually a quotation. He believed that they were subject to the forces or the mazalot of the designated princes like other nations. In other words, like in the book of Daniel, when the angel comes and he says, well, I had to fight with the prince of Persia. Well, it's believed that each of these 70 nations are going to have a designated prince. And because these entities tend to be single-minded, angels tend to be very single-minded once they have a mission. So they're not the greatest at really assimilating all the information. They're sent to do this one thing. And so these princes might find themselves at odds, because if they're single-minded in their supervision of this nation, like the prince of Persia, it may be that a messenger who comes and says, oh no, this is how the plan is going to work out. There might be resistance there. But what Balak didn't realize is that Israel was not like the other nations, kind of functioning in this soup of angelic princes or supernatural princes of the powers of the air. Instead, the Holy One has taken Israel under his own personal protection. His indwelling presence is actually resting in the camp. And so there's nothing he can do in terms of astrology. There's nothing he can do in terms of sorcery that can penetrate into that cloud of glory. Which, if the obverse is true, it suggests that sorcery and magic is used because there might be times where it actually can intervene in the natural forces. It's not worth trying, though, because it's a death sentence. Really, you're playing with death when you do that. It's not our job. It's a rebellion really against, the way that we were created and what we were created to do. So Balak was a Moabite, which means he was a descendant of Lot, and Lot's name meant stealthy. And that's exactly what Balak is. He's pretty stealthy. Rather than just take the Israelites on, he says, we'll do some cursing. We'll try to short circuit this march that they're on. And it's like, if we think back to Lot and what his character was like, in the end, even after seeing Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed, he was ready to do anything but repair his relationship with Abraham. And so if we think of who is destined to descend from Moab and join in the genealogy of Messiah, Ruth. And so what Balak is trying to do here is that he's trying to obstruct the ability of probably one of his own descendants to join the Israelites in purity and righteousness. That's the avenue. The nations have to go through Israel. They don't have their own special, unique paths to God, even though there's lots of bumper stickers that say so. No, it's going to be through Israel, through Abraham, through Isaac, and through Jacob. That is how your seed is going to be called. So any other nation has to go through that avenue. So why? We've talked about that. A curse is a curse is a curse, right? Well, not necessarily. Evil does imitate life and righteousness. And so if we can see a pattern on the side of holiness, we're liable to see a similar pattern on the opposite side, on the side of impurity. So we see Moses, who's the prophet, but Aaron kind of becomes the mouthpiece. He becomes the executor. He becomes the manager of the Mishkan. He puts a lot of legs to Moses' words. So what we have here is Bellam. He has the power of cursing. He has the power of words, but he can benefit from Balak's special knowledge. And the pattern we see is he knew where to go. And we'll see why those places he picked were so important and why he thought they might be successful. But he knew how to pick the most effective place for the curse, while Bellam could pronounce the curse. And so it's like Balak is going to he's going to put legs to it. He's going to choose the place. He's going to oversee the sacrifices that are offered on those idols, while Bellam kind of pulls apart and he just gets the download and speaks. Now, had there not been intervention, of course, we know this download would have come from the realm of death, from dark forces. But because even though he thinks he's manipulating, he's being manipulated, he's getting downloads from the Holy One. So his tongue is actually being twisted from what he wants to speak, and he's being forced to speak blessings instead. You see that pattern, it's going to persist even in the book of Revelation. You're going to have a false prophet who's going to be part of this organization with the beast and the serpent. That's why I say that the evil is always going to try to imitate that which is righteous and holy. So Balak is a descendant, Bellam. Bellam is thought to have been a descendant of Laban because of where he was from, Aram Naharim. And if he is a descendant of Laban, then he probably inherited that belief of Laban's sons that Jacob had robbed their father of all his possessions. That's basically what Laban says. Jacob, everything you have is mine. Even though he earned, every hair on every goat, Laban was never convinced that it wasn't all his. If you spell Laban backward, it's Nabal. And remember Nabal? He was from a different Carmel, not the Mount Carmel, but a different Carmel. But remember when he was shearing his sheep, they had great feasts and, drinking parties and all sorts of stuff happened at sheep shearing and threshing floors. And so after he shears his sheep, David requests, some food for some of his men. And so even though David and his men had been protecting Nabal's property, Nabal refused to send anything as a gift or a thank you. So Nabal was like Lavan. He liked the benefit, but he didn't want to pay the wages for the benefits. So let's look. We can't know for sure if he was a direct descendant of Lavan, but he certainly has the characteristics of Lavan, because it was the wages that lures Balaam to Balak. The wages of cursing. And then we're going to look at some scripture references, even from the New Testament, that seem to bear out this was the lure. And so when Adonai sees that Balaam is just, not, I hate to say has his heart set on going, but he really does. When he sees that, even though he's told Balaam not to, that he's stalling, he's saying, well, spend the night, maybe, I might hear something in the night. He says, okay, if my word is not good enough for you, then I'm going to let you go in the path you want to go. And that's a horrible thing for any of us. When we persist in doing things, even though we know the Father has said, don't do that. And eventually the roadblocks are taken away, and it seems like, oh, well, maybe God wanted me to do this after all. You have to check yourself and say, now, wait a minute, is he just letting me go in the path I wish to go? And you say, well, why would Balaam think that he might change his mind during the night? Even though he's already been told, don't curse Israel. In fact, you can't. Well, let's think about it from his point of view. There is going to be a pattern here that makes it look as though Adonai has changed his mind. If he knows anything about the Israelites, then he knows that it appears that Adonai changed his mind about Abraham sacrificing Isaac. And so if he's ever changed his mind before, if he knows that Abraham bargained for Sodom and Gomorrah, it's just he didn't have enough to bargain with, maybe he could change his mind. And so maybe I could persuade him somehow to change his mind about cursing Israel. And we can have those conversations with ourselves when we just decide we're going to do things that we know we shouldn't do. It's not going to come to a good end. We can tend to reason out. We can find every possible example of how it worked. Even if we know we shouldn't do it, we'll find every possible example of how maybe it did turn out well, knowing that it doesn't apply to our case. It's because we're trying to persist down the path that we've already made up our minds we're going to go. And so at some point, what does he say? My spirit will not contend with man forever. Okay, go ahead. So he releases us to our own desired path to destruction. We never want to fall to that place. We never want to fall to a place of outright rebellion. But that's what happens. That's why I say these dark spiritual forces, they're tapping into the greediness of the human soul. And so whatever it is that we desire, that becomes the bait. What is it do you want? Do you want recognition? Do you want people to think you're smart? Do you want people to think you're talented? Do you want to have a lot of money? Do you want to have popular children? Do you want to wear the best clothes? What is it that you want and that you're not happy until you obtain? Well, that's going to be the bait that draws you to Balak, because in Balaam's case, of course, it's the cash, it's the wages. He wants to make some money, and it could have been very lucrative, because what he can do is say, okay, whatever you would have spent raising an army, pay me that. It's worth that. I'm going to save you a lot of money because you would lose all those men. So what we see here is another example of what testing can do. Tests come in tens. Some of you know that, some of you don't. But tests do come in tens. And if we look at these individual characters like Levi, Jacob, Abraham, Bellam, there are tens that connect them. And what they have in common is that they were each being tested. Tests of righteousness will come in tens. We know Abraham endured 10 tests and he emerged in righteousness. And the list, there's different lists that float around out there. This list that I put on the slide for you is Maimonides' list, 1 through 10. These are the 10 tests. We say, well, it looks like Abraham might have failed some of these. No, he didn't. He didn't always do the right thing, but 10 times he remained loyal to the Holy One. And that's what it's all about. You're not always going to feel like you pass every test. But if at the end of the test, you have not renounced your faith, you have simply recognized that I'm not as strong in that area as I thought I was, I need to see this one coming. That's not a failure. It's a victory because your loyalty is still there in your purpose to do better next time. And so it can be a test of righteousness. There's that list of 10. I won't read them all for you. You can read them yourself. But Numbers 14:22. We see what happens when we rebel in these tests. He says, certainly all the people who have seen my glory and my signs, which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not listened to my voice. Listening to his voice, that's really the test. Not just persisting down your own path, but pausing and saying, what do you need to tell me right now? What am I not hearing? I want to hear your voice. In our case, the simplest thing to do is go to the word. Now, there's going to be individual situations. You say, well, what do I do in this situation? Well, I don't really know because it says this, but then it says that. And I don't know really which one is my situation. That's when you don't get in a hurry. You wait until you're sure that you've heard the voice. You wait until you receive good counsel. You wait until you're firm going forward. And what if you did make a mistake? Does that mean you rebelled? No. If you made a mistake, you made a mistake. You'd be like Abraham. You say, okay, next time I won't call her my sister. I should have seen that one coming. It was a test and it blew right by me and I missed it. Okay, so he blew it in one sense, but he prevailed in another sense because he didn't give up. And so this is what we want to do when we're put to the test. He's saying, I want you to listen to me and I want you to listen for me. And the key to the test is humility. Humility is what's going to lead to your hearing the voice. Because if you've already made up your mind, like Bellam, which direction you're going to go, it might impair how you're hearing the words. You might hear the right words, but you might be filtering them improperly. Deuteronomy 8:3 says, he humbled you and let you go hungry and fed you with the manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, in order to make you understand that man shall not live on bread alone, but man shall live on everything that comes out of the mouth of the Lord. Right. So what was the test for? He humbled you, let you go hungry so that he could feed you the word, so that you would understand that it's a spiritual thing. It's the spiritual word that you need to depend upon. This is what comprises a test. Will you listen to his word, or will you simply persist on the path that you've chosen and not listen to his voice? It's called hearing. So look right here. Look at the difference. Sometimes we've internalized the word as spiritual food will pass the test. But the pattern that the Israelites had is that their fathers did not know. They didn't have all these words that Moses brought to them. They didn't have, they had the basics, but they didn't have a Mishkan. There's so many things that they did not have. They didn't necessarily live on manna. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they had flocks and herds. And so they're being taught through these tests words that their fathers didn't experience. And he's saying, okay, they experienced what they needed to, but now you need to internalize what you need to internalize. So I'm going to test you to see if you will listen to me. So a test is a hearing test. Do you hear me or not? Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel. That's the foundational statement of our faith. So how do we know Abraham's 10 tests were hearing tests? Genesis 26:5 says, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give your descendants all these lands. And by your descendants, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and fulfilled his duty to me, and kept my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Okay, that was his manna in his generation, and he obeyed. Well, that word there translated as obeyed, it's Shema. It means heard. He passed his hearing tests. He fulfilled his duty. No matter what was happening, he tried to fulfill the commandments, the statutes, and laws that were given to him. So what will our hearing test be comprised of? Whether we will obey the commandments, statutes, and laws that he asks us to walk in our generation. So Balaam is going to have this weird journey of 10 tests. And the question is, will he listen to the word that he was told the first time? Don't go. Is he going to persist in the sorcery of his ancestors, like Levi, who was definitely a blasphemer? He was a curser. Think of why Rachel might have stolen Levi's idols. If she stole his household idols, like the birds of Balak, then maybe as a prophetess, she could foresee that he would try to use sorcery against her descendants. She may have been trying to break that cycle of sorcery. Doesn't work. They're still in it. Balaam, he imitates Abraham. He saddles his donkey early in the morning to set out on his 10-test journey. And we know Abraham was going because he was eager to perform the word. He was eager to pass that test. And see, if he executes this test, what Abraham is going to lose is the only wealth that really means anything to him aside from Sarah. Abraham would give up the goats and the camels and the donkeys and the sheep and everything he had in a moment for Isaac's life. And he says, you know what? I want you to give me the only wealth that means anything to you. Give me Isaac. He passed the test. What Balaam is doing is the exact opposite. He's circumventing the word in order to obtain wealth through death. So when Abraham hears the word, life comes into the world. But if Balaam had persisted in his true plan, he would have brought death into the world. Imagine if Balaam had persisted in cursing Israel and it actually worked. The plan for life to the world would have become death to the world. So here's Balaam's 10 tests. And again, I'm not going to read it to you. You can read those for yourself. But 10 times he rebels against that original word. You don't go. You cannot curse them. Well, 10 times he rebels. And so as Abraham demonstrates his loyalty to the word through 10 tests, Balaam is going to rebel against the word 10 times. And to show us this, the commentators point out that in verses in Numbers 22 through 35, it uses the phrase, the angel of Yod He Vav He, 10 times, showing us basically how Balaam is going to defy the angel of Yod He Vav He 10 times. He's going to rebel. He's going to fail 10 tests. And Balaam was considered especially wicked because he didn't just practice sorcery for money. He actually taught others immorality. He taught them how to do it. And that's the opposite of Abraham. Of Abraham, Genesis 18:19, it says, "For I have chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about it." Well, that's the difference. Balaam taught others to be immoral. Abraham teaches his offspring and his descendants after him to do righteousness and justice. The journey, of course, he encounters the angel 3 times, and the fence that he passed coming from Aram Naharaim is thought to have been formed from the heap of stones that were erected by his ancestor Laban and Jacob. Remember, they made this monument out of a heap of stones, and they made an oath not to cross past those stones in order to harm one another. So even though, I mean, it's almost like Home Alone, the things that happened to Balaam on this journey. The donkey injures his foot, pressing him up against the stones, and he still persists. He just keeps going, and he breaks the oath. The question is, why does the angel appear 3 times? Well, each time it's a little bit different. And it's thought that each of these times represents one of the patriarchs. And the first time, the angel gives Balaam lots of room to escape into the field. And so Balaam at this point, Balaam, if you're going to go do this, you have other options. If you're just bound and determined to curse the descendants of Abraham, then why not curse the descendants of Ishmael or the sons of Keturah? If you're after Abraham's offspring, you have other options. Curse somebody else. No, he's bent. So the second time is thought to represent the generations of Isaac. He's only given one way of escape. He's only given one other option. And so the idea here is, okay, if you must curse the descendants of Isaac, then curse the descendants of Esau. No. And then that brings him to the third encounter. There's no way to turn aside from this. He's determined to curse the generation of Jacob. But the problem is these 12 tribes are already blessed and sealed over to the times of Messiah. So getting to the method, we see that Balaam lets Balak build altars on 3 locations from which the 12 tribes might be cursed. He's not just trying to curse the descendants of Abraham. He had other options. He's not just trying to curse the descendants of Isaac. He has other options. He's trying to curse specifically the 12 tribes descended from Jacob. So here comes the bribe. And if you've ever thought you could bribe God, this particular Torah portion teaches you that you can't. He will not be bribed. Just like we can't create a golden calf, pin his name on it, and say we're dedicating it to him. That didn't fly. Well, these altars aren't going to fly either. No matter how many rams and various gifts that they put on these altars and these 3 locations, it's not going to bribe him. He's not going to change his mind. But Balak, remember, he has a special skill set. He knows what to offer and he knows where to offer it. So he selects 3 strategic locations and he's going to offer 7 sacrifices or gifts, perhaps trying to bribe Elohim into permitting the curses. The first place he takes him was to a high place of Baal. It says Numbers 22:41. Then it came about in the morning that Balak took Bellam and brought him up to the high places of Baal, and he saw from there a portion of the people. Well, remember what our tribe is that has a sketchy history with the high places of Baal? Even though they all engaged at some point, it's the tribe of Dan. He always seems to be out there in the idol territory. And so from there, it's thought that he saw the tribe of Dan. And he said, you know what? You'll see the tribe. We'll put these gifts right here, draw the Holy One's attention to this altar with these gifts. And then it's going to be right near the tribe of Dan. He'll look at them and say, well, you know what? They're just going to turn out to be a bunch of idolaters. Go ahead and curse them. Didn't happen. Couldn't happen. Next week, we're going to break down the blessings and what those represent. But the 7 altars corresponded, they believe, to the 7 altars built by the 7 righteous ones up until that point. Adam, who they thought offered sacrifices in Eden. We don't know what type of sacrifices. There's some evidence that if there's not going to be killing and destroying on the holy mountain, that it would have been like mincha sacrifices, the grain sacrifices. Abel, Noah, Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Moshe. Those are the 7 righteous ones. So this is what I mean by watching the techniques, how the wicked, the unholy, will try to hook in. They'll try to tap into the power of righteousness. And so that lineage of those 7 righteous ones led to the nation of Israel. So Bilam is like, he's speaking now on behalf of the 70 nations. And he's basically trying to bribe him and say, hey, forget these 12 tribes, forget Israel, and just accept the honor of the nations as they are. But of course, that wasn't going to work. Those nations would have to come through Israel. And so Bilam can't help himself. He starts to bless instead of to curse. And even though we can talk more about the actual content of the blessings next week, the Midrash says that the Moabites' concern about the Israelites was the clouds of glory that surrounded them. Even though the Israelites could see out and they could go in and out, their enemies could not see them. And so they realized after they've conquered Sihon and they've conquered Og, we can't defeat these people with natural weapons. We have to use words. This is what upholds them. The word is what upholds them. And so it's going to have to be words that bring them down. And so that might explain why Bilam, he as he's uttering the blessing, he's saying, I am one who's had his eyes uncovered. He's had his supernatural eyes uncovered, because had that not happened, based on this, he wouldn't have even been able to see them. He had to have his eyes supernaturally uncovered in order to see them. Because when Israel dwells in unity, remember, it's the most beautiful blessing. They still say it in the synagogue. How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. So when Israel dwells in unity, it's very difficult for their enemies to see them. Something to think about. And there's also that principle of going out and coming in Scripture, which again, that would be a great one for me to put together for you to have, like, for your vocabulary book. But In this case, being able to go out and to come in, remember Moses is no longer able to go out and come in, but he's talking about leading the people out to war, because that's what they would do. They would have to go out of the clouds of glory to go to war. And that's why at that point it activated a commandment. If you go out to war, take a trowel with you to take care of your business, because once you go out of the cloud and start eating natural food, then your body, the digestive part of your body, whereas manna is a perfect food, and so you're not going to bring an impurity into the camp as long as you're eating perfect food. You go outside of the clouds, you'll be eating imperfect food, and that's going to activate your digestive system, and you're going to have to dig latrines, basically. But they're able to go out and come in at will. And as we've talked so many times about the realms that Yeshua could go in and out of. He could see people, they couldn't see him until he wanted them to see him, and then they could see him. He would have to uncover their eyes so that they could see him in that realm. So that just kind of tells you, when we get caught up together with him in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, what kind of abilities we may have at that point, that we can be dispatched out, to go do service, to do work. But if we go into the cloud, then in essence, we're concealed. People can't see you. Normal people with natural eyes cannot see you. The second location is Pisgah, which is also called Mount Nebo. I apologize for the photobomb in there, but I clipped it as much as I could. And that's from Beit Hogla, looking across the Jordan. And I can't tell you exactly which of those mountains is Nebo. I just know that it's over there where the Fady part is, because it's on the other side of the Jordan River. But Jericho would be off to our kind of left of that picture. So he takes him next to see where Moses is going to die and where the Israelites are going to cross the Jordan. Numbers 23:13 says, Balak said to him, please come with me to another place from where you may see them, although you will only see the extreme end of them and will not see all of them, and put a curse on them for me from there. So he took him to the field of Zuphim, to the top of Pisgah, and he built 7 altars and offered a bull and a ram on each altar. So there, the extreme end of them. What is he looking for? Well, the extreme end of Israel at this point is Moses. He's like, this would dishearten the people. Without Moses, with Moses dead, how would things go on? But Numbers 23:21 states, he has not looked at misfortune in Jacob, nor has he seen trouble in Israel. The Lord his God is with him. Doesn't matter if Moses is not with him, the Lord his God is with him. And it says, the joyful shout of a king is among them. So, again, they tried pointing out idolatry in the tribe of Dan. That didn't work. So now they attack the extreme end, or the death of Moses and the Jordan crossing. And the second location was to curse those who keep the covenant made through Moses, and then to obstruct Israel's physical crossing into the land itself. If you can keep Israel out of the land, then you can really take down the power of what's supposed to be accomplished in the land by Israel and obedience and covenant. That doesn't work either. See, even without Moses, Israel didn't cross into the land alone. Their king was among them. And according to the Midrash, I thought this was just beautiful. The little notation said in the verse there, the joyful shout of a king is among them, where it says, Veteruat melech bo. They say that denotes the shofar sound of the king is with Yehoshua. And we know Yeshua is the short form of Yehoshua. The shofar sound of the king is with Yeshua. It doesn't matter if Moses dies on Mount Nebo Yeshua is going to be with them. Yeshua is going to help us cross back over to the Jordan. The enemy has always tried to prevent Israel from crossing into the land, and to this day, it does not want Israel on that land. And so the final place here, Numbers 23:28, Balak took Bellam to the top of Peor, which overlooks the desert. And we know this is Israel's downfall. We've had the golden calf, we've had the 10 spies, we've had little incidents in between. This is going to be a bad one. This is going to be where the young men are seduced by the Moabite women, because Bellam is going to teach the women how to seduce the Israelite men. So the third attempt on the top of Peor is to attack the next generation, the youth. And it's primarily through sexual activity. The sexual activity will lead to the idolatry. So with this partial vision of sorcery, Balak could see that Peor would be catastrophic to the Israelites. That third altar is actually built with extra sacrifices, attempting to curse the young men of the generation. So this brought the total of the sacrifices to 42. And so we've got young men who didn't learn from the previous generation that fell in the wilderness, kind of disrespect the previous generation, and they fail to keep the covenant. They practice immorality, they practice idolatry, they're going to fall. But you don't really need a special curse to do that. That's just the logical result of those behaviors. But there's a connection here. In the time of Elisha, he miraculously healed the waters of Jericho. And like I said, from that spot where I was trying to show you Mount Nebo or Pisgah, off to the left there was Jericho, where they crossed the Jordan. Remember when Jordan fell, or Jericho fell, Joshua curses it, like nobody can rebuild that again. But in the time of Elisha, he miraculously healed the waters of Jericho, which the successive cities weren't built in the exact same spot. But he did this by throwing salt in them, and salt represents covenant. After he left the city, a gang of youths, young men, accosted Elisha. They insulted him, they blasphemed the name. And somehow Elisha perceived that there's not going to be any repentance here. These guys are completely given over to the curse of Peor, and they're not going to produce godly offspring. So Elisha pronounces the name, and suddenly there's a forest, 2 she-bears come out, and they tear apart 42 young men, the exact number of sacrifices that were offered as bribes, basically, for the curse. So what does that mean? Well, 2 Kings 2:21, when Elisha lifts the curse off the waters of Jericho, he says, I have purified these waters. There shall not come from there death or any unfruitfulness any longer. The implication is these 42 young men were unfruitful men. Like I said, he perceived that nothing good was going to come out of them. That young, they're already blaspheming, disrespectful, disrespecting the memory of Elijah. Because remember, they said, go up, you bald head. Like, you go up like Elijah did, Baldy. Taunting prophets. And so he says, okay, I'm going to lift this curse of unfruitfulness. Well, in the process of lifting it, it sounds like the natural result was the unfruitful young men were taken away. Because Joshua had cursed it back in Joshua 6:26. He says, cursed before the Lord is the man who rises up and builds this city, Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn, he will lay its foundation, and with the loss of his younger son, he will set up its gates. So are these residuals from those curses? Were these natural consequences That might be a topic to debate. That might be a, coffee and Torah topic. I don't know the answer to it. What I do know is that with hearing, with obedience, the curse was annulled with salt. And again, that denotes the covenant. And so that curse from Peor, and remember Peor, it was both a fertility cult and a death cult. I won't tell you some of the practices because we don't need to know. You can look it up. But specifically, fertility and death cult. So there was nothing left there with any power to poison the fruit. And it's almost as if when Elisha purifies the water, it just draws out the bad apples so they can be destroyed. And that's why, I mean, we're kind of in a unique situation here, as they were in the book of Acts, that as long as there's the power of the Holy Spirit moving in our lives, it's going to draw out some things. It's going to draw out the poison apples. And it's to their destruction eventually. But while they're taunting and being sarcastic and blaspheming and those sorts of things, it's not comfortable. And then just a few examples here to show you the sin of Balaam and Balak. Revelation 2:14, he says, I have a few things against you because you have some there who hold the teaching of Balaam, who kept teaching Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality. In other words, as you're reading this passage in the book of Revelation, it's telling you to go back to this Torah portion. It's telling you to go back here to understand what's happening. Jude 1:11, it says, woe to them, for they have gone the way of Cain, and for pay, they have given themselves up to the error of Balaam and perished in the rebellion of Korach. For pay, there's a payoff here. 2 Peter 2:13 says, they are stains and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions as they feast with you. That's what I'm telling you. These people will walk with you. They will have the same vocabulary as you. So you have to test that fruit. The poison apples, the bad apples, they will show up if you give them time. You give people time and they will tell you who they are. And believe them when they tell you who they are. Don't be so naive that you don't believe them. But where are they going to show up? Specifically at your feasts. There'll be other places too, but you can count on them showing up at your feasts. It says, having eyes full of adultery that never cease from sin, enticing unstable souls, having hearts trained in greed, accursed children, just like we saw the 42 youths that Elisha cursed. And the she-bears ate them. Abandoning the right way, they've gone astray, having followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the reward of unrighteousness. And there it goes again, the wages of unrighteousness. That's really it right there. And that's a hard one to do because we want to believe that everybody walking with us is there for the same reason we are. We want to believe that because people use Yeshua, that they observe the Shabbat, that they keep the feasts, that they're just like us. Same motivations. Well, you just read, you can expect them at your feasts. But they're just there to teach immorality. They're there for a payoff. They're seeking a reward, and for different people, it's a different reward. There are people out there who will not be part of anything that they can't take over a major role. You find that out when you find a congregation, when you deal with a congregation, when you assemble at feasts, there are people who will come to conferences not to learn anything, just simply to pass out their latest thing, their latest calendar, their latest study. There's a payoff. And that's why we have to be so careful. The more we learn Torah, we must never believe that we can misdirect the glory that goes to him alone. Uzi, seriously, dude. And simply get into Torah because it makes us feel smart. Or it makes us feel righteous, more righteous than somebody else. Or it makes us feel like we know more. That's not a reason. Piglet, stop. Always check those motives, because you know what? It feels nice when you teach the word to somebody, or you just show a word to somebody. Not even have to be a teacher. It could be a coworker. When they go, wow, that's really neat. I never saw that. We get a little charge. Don't let that be your real reward. You're going to feel good when you can share the word with somebody, but don't get addicted to the payoff. As a payoff, you rejoice with them. That's not your reward for studying the word. It's not, really, it isn't. You know, trust me, to be on a stage, to be behind a pulpit, to have a title behind your name, none of those things means anything. They're nothing in this world or the next. It's humility and remaining loyal through the tests. Because no matter what we know, we'll run into somebody that knows a little bit more. You can't measure yourself by what you know. You measure yourself by who you know.